Hey everybody, Jason Burmis here, and Happy New Year. First off, this is the first broadcast that we've done in 2022, and I think it's really a good one to start the year because we are in 2022, and we are in the very real throes of a fourth industrial revolution where, unfortunately, we have a techno-fascist predator class that is beginning to usher in transhumanism on an unprecedented level, whether you realize that or not. So when I saw Dyer talking about the Rand Corporation and how they were really put into place to run the world in a Malthusian manner through think tanks and policies outside of government, I thought it would be great to get him on to further discuss where Rand comes from in this post-World War II, born classified kind of government we went into, and where they are now. You can find everything Jay Dyer over at jaysanalysis.com. You can follow him at J_D007. And Jay, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you had a happy new year, my friend. Before we even get into everything, let people know who you are and how you kind of came across this information and why it was so important to you.
Thanks, dude. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I always love coming on your show. We've done a lot of really good podcasts over the last year and a half. So I would recommend if you're new to me and Burmis Talking, be sure and go check out the ones that we've done in the past. We've done a lot of movie reviews, which were really good. But yeah, so I do a lot of analysis of film, philosophy, geopolitics, religious debates, pretty much anything you can think of. A lot of ridiculous comedy as well. And we put that out every day. So, this is just what I do. I've been doing this for the last 5 years, full time, and then part-time 5 years prior to that. A lot of fart time involved in that part-time. But so I heard about Rand. Probably most of us have heard about Rand from Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. Right? That's what's being parodied in that classic satire movie. And that is, of course, called the Bland Corporation. But Kubrick, although, I don't agree with all of Kubrick's stances, he did understand that a lot of the Cold War was overblown. It was a lot of staged and managed dialectics. Now, I'm saying at the high levels it was. I'm not saying there weren't, people out there doing real Soviet CIA espionage and whatnot. But at the top, there was a lot of people playing both sides, right? Victor Rothschild's a famous double agent that we know about that was giving information to both MI6 and to the Soviets, to the KGB. So I think at those higher levels, we can begin to see why or how it's possible then that there could be something like the Rand Corporation, some big think tank entity that would want to have something like the Cold War. So the biggest thing that the Rand Corporation did in history, unless, we can get into debating what roles there might be in terms of the Kufid narrative. But in terms of the 20th century, their big brainchild was the Cold War. So the ideas of mutually assured destruction, the idea of the doomsday clock, the idea of at any moment we're all going to be nuked by, Russia or whatever. These are all Rand Corporation ideas, and they're big scale, big idea people. So basically, to sum up this initiation into what the Rand Corporation is, I would say if we think about Obamacare, if we think about something like Operation Iraqi Freedom, if we think about something like the war on poverty and the welfare state, if we think about how America was transitioned from a production-based economy to a service-based economy, literally every one of those are examples of things that were dreamt up in the Rand Corporation and then pushed out into America to turn it into the dystopian nightmare that we're going into.
And it's so funny because I'm over on rand.org right now, and the top thing they're talking about is manipulating the climate. What are the geopolitical risks? And they're talking, of course, about geoengineering technologies that could block the sun rays or siphon huge amounts of carbon from the air, are not that far out of reach. No, actually, they've been developed and deployed over the last 3 to 4, maybe even 5 decades. And that's what I think the essential role of the Rand Corporation is. It's to come up with these ideals and push these narratives that are kind of already in place by the military-industrial complex and have to be adopted by the public. So one of the documents I've been talking about recently is a Rand document, and it is Brain-Computer Interfaces, U.S. Military Applications and Implications, and it's Security 2040, so we're in 2022. But one of the big things that I like to point out about this document, especially in today's times, and we are on YouTube, Jay, just a warning, we all know the rules. So basically, if you look at what this is, I just want to read this paragraph for people so they can understand that the FDA, the NIH, they're not your friends. They're in on this. A key effort fueling most of these topics has been the brain research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies initiative at the National Institute of Health. This effort is broadly aimed at revolutionizing our understanding of the human brain. Brain partners include the National Science Foundation, DARPA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Agency, IARPA, as well as foundations, institutes, universities, and industries. Then it goes on to say that the NIH allocated $46 million in 2014 and another $81.4 million in 2015, reflecting growing interest. Now think about that. That's now 6-7 years ago, and we're talking over $100 million just in a couple stints. It's way more than that. And overall, DARPA, as you know, has invested hundreds of millions of dollars since the early 2000s publicly. Really an unlimited supply of funds and resources in the multiple billions if you get into the black projects and what's underground. But what you do is you have these organizations kind of put it into a bland documentation for others to read in the arenas of technology and sometimes geopolitics, and these become the ideal sets and the accepting narratives that we're supposed to follow. And most of the time, it's never asked whether or not these technologies are actually good to be implemented. It's a push-forward mentality.
Absolutely. I think one thing most people don't think about with Rand is that its origins are literally in the marriage of public-private partnership. So a lot of people think, oh, that's some just nerds that sit around, playing with calculators and coming up with ideas. No. Rand Corporation comes out of the Air Force. It comes out of General Curtis LeMay. It comes out of the Douglas Aircraft Company. So you have an explicit marriage of multiple generals, Air Force heads saying, we got to come up with this, this ideas place that's basically going to sell, like you said, nerdy things to the public. And the specific charge that they had was to create a parallel kind of government that is scientific. So there's the government that we think of as, the politicians and these people. And Rand is a great example of the parallel government, which is specifically stated to be scientific government, or AKA technocracy. So people think that America is a freedom-based country. We're against the fascists, like Mussolini was. The marriage of corporation and government. That's what he defined it as. But no, actually, the Rand Corporation is literally that very thing.
Well, again, when you talk about LeMay now, LeMay, again, is this post-World War II figure. I mean, obviously involved in World War II, but post-World War II figure where you start having the erections of things like Area 51. And now we have the black sites, and we're taking the models from what Oppenheimer and everybody did in the Manhattan Project, and we're going to put those forth into all these new avenues of technology, some of which we have been developing, but some we learned from the Nazis, especially in the field of not only weapons, but biological warfare. I mean, these are a reality. And when you talk about Area 51 and you talk about Rand and these other corporations, you really can't talk about them without talking about the ARPA coming up and having other institutions such as not only, the Central Intelligence Agency, because that's kind of the face of spies, right? But you had all these other organizations like NASA coming in And for instance, some of the people that were recruited for the black projects at Area 51 thought they were going to be astronauts, right? And if you talk about NASA, they're one of these same thing think tanks. This is a 2001 document, The Future Strategic Warfare. It really lays out a lot of this biomedical transhumanism. If you look at it, the bots, Borgs, and humans welcome you to 2025 AD, folks. This is why we're focusing on it. It's only 3 years away. And these projects have been advanced in the background, and now the public is being manipulated to accept them, especially in the sense of the security state based on our health now. It's not just terrorism. It's our health. So why don't you get into that and how ultimately the vast majority of what they're promoting technologically is transhumanist?
Absolutely. Yeah. Rand is definitely at the center of the selling of transhumanism. One thing I would say that probably should be touched on is, before that and how we got to that, is Rand's philosophy. And they actually had this unique move to where they wanted to get philosophy going as a part of this think tank approach, and that was my area of research. So I was piqued when I read that, and one thing that they found useful was the notion of the cult of the individual and basically atomization of society. So those are actually Rand ideas, and I'm not trying to make a economic statement here about Ayn Rand or anything like that, but the idea based on a purely individually motivated desire to fulfill just one's base passions, for example, is a thing that the Rand Corporation saw as a way to convince the public to be just selfish, basically. So when we look at things like consumerism, which literally was the thing dreamt up by Rand, or when we look at the way that social media turns people into these sort of selfish and narcissistic people, those are really literally from the Rand Corporation. They pioneered this idea of rational choice theory, game theory. These are all Rand ideas, and the philosophy was that the more that we sell consumerism, the more that people will only act in their base self-interest, based desires, etc. So degrading the public, all these things are kind of the result of this, and that's because they adopted a position of what they called quant, or quantification. And all that means is that we don't have souls. There's no transcendent. We're just basically meat sacks that can be programmed like a computer. And the more that they debase the society, the more that they can steer the society into controlling everybody on the basis of just degrading stuff. That's why the toxic culture is so important. And that's why they hired all these philosophers, mathematicians, computer tech guys like John von Neumann, Albert Wolfstetter, Herman Kahn. These are the people that dreamt up the whole, let's just scare everybody. Now, the reason that I mention them is because a lot of these Rand people had an interesting political philosophy known as Trotskyite. So that not only had they been influenced by Trotsky's philosophy of Red Terror, they were also influenced by Leo Strauss, as you mentioned, who was a member of Nazi philosophy, right? So they did this weird move where they combined Straussian Nazi philosophy with Red Terror fear. And what do you get? You get a total top-down dictator corporate Cold War scare scenario. And that same model of what they've done back at that time, scaring everybody, is exactly where we are now. Atomizing everybody, getting everybody totally scared, hypochondria everywhere in society over coof, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And what that does is prepare people, as Klaus argues, and as is in the document, the Lockstep document, it says that one thing that social distancing and these kinds of things will do is move society towards automation.
Yes.
So yes. Automation of everything on the basis of the fact that you don't need to go see a relative when they're dying in the old folks' home. The relatives now have robots that they talk to, like you showed, right? That automation was the end goal of all of the fear through the Cold War and through, the war on terror. That's also Rand Corporation stuff. War on terror. That's from these guys. And that's how it gets us to transhumanism, is the old end goal, put you into the matrix. That's it.
And let's talk about how managing meat sacks. I like how you put that, because this is that very Malthusian idea on what is an average life worth and what can we get out of it, and really why is it there. And as we move to automation, obviously human beings will be less and less important to the predatory class. You know, you have people such as Dennis Bushnell, who's still the chief scientist over at NASA, discussing 10 years ago how in 15 years, again, that 2025 marker that just keeps coming back up, it will be tough for those that do not have brain chips in the arena of military fields to keep up with other soldiers. Now, there's a lot of hype around the fact that China is openly building super soldiers. But the truth of the matter is that we've been doing this type of experimentation for a very long time behind the scenes. And often what we do is we use very innocuous agencies. You know, Rand, again, not a real agency, but one of the ones I like to point to because it's documented is the Department of Energy. And the Department of Energy, of course, was running all these different types of human experimentation via radiation, but that is only a small subset of what they were doing. Just like in MK Ultra, it's just a small subset of LSD. There were so many other methods and so many other drugs utilized in these programs, Jay.
Absolutely. No, you're spot on. I came across this really fascinating section, so I had forgotten where this paragraph was in this book, and I could not remember it for the last year. And then I finally found it when I went back to this gigantic Rand Corporation book that I have. You're going to love this. So if you want to understand what all this really is about, there's a great example during the Cold War of this Rand meeting. And I won't read very long, but it says basically, in a statement that was crafted after assuming the presidency of this foundation, this is referring to a meeting, a thing called the Gaither Report. This is very crucial to the Cold War. Gaither stated as his goal a society where technocracy would rule using purely objective analysis. Philanthropy, in his view, should not only help the needy, but also advise those responsible for the formation of public policy. So this is the tax exempt,
NGO births.
Yeah, exactly. And it says this partnership then would allow the Ford Foundation a great positive force and enable it to plan a unique and effective role in the sometimes controversial task of helping realize the democracy's goals. That just means their goals for democracy. The Ford Foundation's alignment then with the U.S. government policies continued throughout the 1960s, and this Gaither report supported this foundation effort to achieve these means through American political and psychological warfare. So they're saying basically using psychological warfare on the American people to get this through. And I'll end with this part where it says that this included some of the top Fortune 100 of that time. So this is basically, it's saying that Ford Foundation, several of the corporate elites getting together, putting together this Gaither report, that is basically a masterminded thing from the Rand Corporation to use psychological warfare to convince the public to accept technocracy. And that was back in I lost the day, 50 something. But
well, again, so Rand comes out in 48. This is very much that World War II era that we get warned about by an insider. This is what Eisenhower was speaking of. And when you talk about, for instance, psychological warfare, going back to this NASA document, when they're talking about all sorts of goodies for how basically they will combat what they need to inside the continental United States, it's information, internet, and psychological warfare, which is extremely, quote unquote, inexpensive towards them. And, not to get too far down into where we are today because we have to be careful. But one of the things, I was talking to my brother today, and he had watched the Malone-Rogan interview. And Malone said the first thing, that we really have to understand right now is you've got a third of the population globally in a mass psychosis. And that's something that you have to acknowledge and really deal with. And I would argue that really it's more than that when we're talking about certain issues. Certainly automation, what transhumanism really means, what a UBI could mean for society, what this top-down control has done, what NGOs or non-government organizations posing as foundations are really about. Because again, you didn't have that many at the time when they have this document, right? You had the Ford, you had the Carnegie Institution. I'm not even sure if the Rockefellers had figured out to get in that game yet. It might be right around that precipice for the Rockefeller Foundation. But that was the move that you saw in the second half of the century, the empowerment of these organizations, the deification of these organizations, the posing as philanthropists. Meanwhile, they were really directing policy and taking on the privatized aspects of a lot of these black programs, especially things like MK Ultra. It was the institutions and the NGOs that were actually experimenting on people through these operations.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I noticed was the book that's really good on this is sort of the inside track by Alex Abeyah, Soldiers of Reason. And even though that is basically a book that they allowed him to write and said, yeah, you can come in and look at the archives and we okay you writing this book, we don't care. So even if you argue that it was a whitewash, it still admits everything. Like, it still tells us everything that we're interested in knowing about the NWO. And then this book has insights that I noticed when you were talking about DARPA and ARPA, that when I read Annie Jacobson's gigantic history of DARPA, they both will talk about things that the other one doesn't mention. So like there'll be things in this about DARPA and people who were the like the Jason Society, which is all these it's an elite scientism society basically.
And it's not an acronym. It's just the Jason Society. It's the weirdest thing.
It's not yours, right? It's not Jason Berman's society.
No, it's not me. I got nothing to do with it, guys.
I'm Jason too, by the way. But
yeah, we're
so
double Jasons, and we're not in the
society,
Jason
like
Society.
But yeah, so in her book, she will refer to things that Rand was up to that Abeyah doesn't. Abeyah will refer to things that Rand and DARPA were up to that, so both books are really good for tying the two together. And a lot of the people who are involved in DARPA are Rand people. That's the point here. And a lot of it's a revolving door thing is basically what I'm trying to say. All that to say that one of the things that Rand pioneered was the idea of global threat. So yes, in World War I and World War II, people noticed that these global conflicts had the ability to change the way people perceived everything. And so they studied the ability of the idea of a global threat to just change minds, change perception, changing images of man, another one of these important white papers that talks about this stuff. So for example, they did a lot of psychological experimentation with the idea of the Soviet threat. The Reds as a global threat is literally a Rand Corporation propaganda invention. Now, there is some Soviet espionage red threat in the Cold War. Yes, there were spies, Alger Hiss, this kind of stuff, sure. But what Rand's job is to blow this up. And if you remember, what immediately succeeds the Cold War red threat? It's the war on terror. Another invented global threat blown up out of proportion. What succeeds that? You could argue mass, SHOOTER, perhaps. Mm-hmm. But now it is transitioned into the new global threat, which everybody can figure out. And I'm just trying to explain that giant global threats don't just organically arise. They are 100% engineered and sold to the public. That's what I'm trying to say. And Rand is the kind of thing that plays a role in inventing and selling that.
So let's talk about that revolving door, because that's so key to this, right? At some point, a lot of these people are working in organizations for the Defense Department, and then what? Around classified information the rest of us are not privy to. They then go into the private sector arena and are able to direct these initiatives around them and what we're going to do papers, and this is our position, and let's start exploring that. And when you talk about utilizing fear as threats and developing that, I'm so glad you mentioned Annie Jacobson, because she really hammers home several times in the Area 51 book that the War of the Worlds broadcast and how the public reacted to it was really taken notice by our Defense Department. and they saw for the first time this massive opportunity to really direct the public in narratives based on fear propaganda. And it was one of those things where I think that she realized time and time again that they would utilize this. And, when she goes into later books, on more contemporary topics like DARPA, she's always tried to play the middle of the road. But one of the things she said in public is that, often when I would be there for these types of interviews and they were showing me this amazing technology, for instance, somebody who was wearing the Luke arm that we've all seen, something out of Star Wars, and he's controlling with his mind, and it's basically just, this thing that he's wearing. When the cameras are off, he takes that off and he goes to the more practical, just hook and a stick. You've seen them, the little appendage and the little hook on it from like Kingpin. And she said, basically she was alluding to the fact that even though this technology exists, it's not to the point that it's really empowering human beings, and human beings are still comfortable with this technology, but they're still trying to promote it as the only solution to these problems. And I think that's a really powerful thing to state, because they also overemphasize what goodies we're all going to get and how this is going to empower society and it's going to improve our human lives, when in fact the vast majority of this stuff for the vast majority of people will be used to enslave us.
Yeah, they always use that sales pitch of the wounded vet, the wounded warrior who lost his legs and now he's got robot legs. See, we're helping you. But of course, that's just selling the ideas. That's not going to be for the masses. The masses are going to be put into metaverse enslavement, right? Into the pod. Get in your pod and die, bro. That's what get in the pod, eat the bugs and die. That's the message here from Greta and Klaus. And let me give an example. So, you had mentioned that Malthusian idea, right? So the quantification philosophy that Rand totally adopted is 100% Malthusian. The Rand guys all believe, we've got to sell people on the idea that there's not enough resources, that, everybody's going to die. They're big proponents, obviously, of Depop. And one thing that they learned about those mass fear campaigns, for example, was how necessary the global government was on the basis of the nuclear threats. So nuclear weapons, which comes out of United Nations planning for global government, is also centered around Rand Corporation fear ideas that because we now have this type of weaponry, the only way to deal with this is to have a global government. That's a Rand idea. Rand came up with the idea. We can sell people on global government by scaring the crap out of them with the nukes. So again, think about the modus operandi here of Malthusians to scare the crap out of you to accept global government technocracy. Do you think that they're really giving you robo arms because they love you? Do you think that they care about your health? The same people saying we need mass depop suddenly care about your health? Come on.
I totally agree, and I'm so glad that you were talking about it in the nuclear warfare aspect of building global governance, because one of the major things that comes out of the Cold War is now we are going to legitimize the United Nations militarily, and we are going to bring about NATO alliances. And exactly. Because that is a large grouping and interassociation that you did not have pre-World War II, right? We had the Allied powers, and we didn't have a United Nations with the kind of teeth it began to get. And again, is that global government? Well, so many people, Jay, were saying, well, the United Nations, it's not a government agency just a few years ago. But yet every single directive that we've seen, especially in the realm of big tech censorship, has been based on what? UN and World Health Organization authoritative information. So, talk about that aspect of how the United Nations kind of grows with this global governance through these policies and the Cold War, because I think that's extremely important.
Yeah, that's essentially just an adjunct of all of these same people. The land for the UN building donated by the Rockefeller family, and it's really just a creation of these, Quigley says, these private banking elite families, the corporate 100. That's who's really behind UN. and it's not even debated, right? Quigley makes this point many times, and he says that the whole idea for why we need the UN and why we need the global government is to police the nukes, because now there's rogue nations. Oh, rogue nations. So rogue nations is another one of these ideas dreamt up by these guys for the justification for the global government, because at any point, and you can begin to see how this is developing into war on terror, right? I mean, what is the nuke thing? It's scaring the crap out of you. What is the idea that ISIS, who these guys can bring the towers down at any point? The BOMB. There's this idea of the cult of the BOMB, and that's a Rand Corporation idea. It's actually lampooned in Planet of the Apes 2 or 3, which is actually a pretty funny scene because they have this church sequence where it's like people in robes and they're playing an organ and they're all worshiping the Balm Almighty. And that's actually parroting the very thing that the Rand Corporation was kind of trying to promote, because now what H-bomb, A-bomb, maybe I should spell that. You know what I'm saying? The whole NUKE thing, what that's about is a invoking of the beyond, as some people have written, which is the idea that the new stand-in for man's fear of the beyond, it's no longer God, it's no longer into that kind of stuff. Now it's the bomb, and now it's the NUKE. And again, that even comes up in Strangelove. And they actually worked with Hollywood people, so they would actually bring in Hollywood people to consult. Rand Corporation, DARPA did too, by the way. At the end of Danny Jacobson's book, she got several chapters about like movies like Terminator and James Cameron stuff being consulted on by DARPA. So when you're watching Terminator, you're actually seeing a symbiotic thing created between DARPA and Hollywood people. And just going full circle, I'm trying to refresh myself with the notes from the Abea book. You were right. I forgot that there was a direct connection between John Nash, Edward Teller, and NASA, and that's because Edward Teller is the father of not just the idea of ABOMB, but also geoengineering.
And not only that, but Edward Teller was probably involved in many different propulsion system and basically different types of flights. I mean, Edward Teller, Lord knows what we have outside of rocket technology, folks, but I can tell you that we have other technologies that have been utilized, and Teller was one of those guys. Teller heavily referenced in the Area 51 book. And again, all of these things born out of that post-World War II epicenter, where I really believe that was almost the end of the judicial, executive, and legislative branches having any type of true checks and balances. Because once something can be born classified and shoved so far down a hole, and then those same representatives who know what is in those deep, dark holes are able to create and then represent these third-party organizations like RAND, which then have their tentacles sent out everywhere, you no longer have that checks and balances system. And I think one of the reasons, again, that focusing on RAND is big is because we can often talk about things like the Council on Foreign Relations, where there are many people with faces and names we know about in the political arenas, and yes, they're putting out policy papers, etc. But you almost never, ever hear about RAND unless you're directly working in the field of the military-industrial complex. And, talk about that aspect, because there are other organizations out there that maybe don't do what RAND do, but then later down the line kind of parrot those technologies, such as the Gartner Institute and others that will put out these tech reports that are strictly going out to smaller tech companies. And it really shows that kind of compartmentalization on where it starts and how it reaches out into the masses.
Yeah, you could think of, with DARPA, and I'm sure you remember back at the time after the Big Nine, there was the idea of total information awareness. And
yes.
This was an early thing that I think we're going into now, where they were basically positing on the basis of John Poindexter's idea that we could have total surveillance of all things at all times, directed to, basically supercomputer type technology, tracking and tracing of everything. And even though supposedly, right, this was eventually kind of shut down, I don't think it was shut down. Like you said, there's a lot of these black budget projects that just keep going, and they go in under other projects, and they moved to other places, other military bases, other private installations. One thing I forgot to mention too was I'm reading the book on the Phoenix Project right now by Doug Valentine, and in Annie Jacobson's DARPA book, one thing I didn't recognize was that DARPA pioneered testing out drone warfare and surveillance in Vietnam. And that idea for total air dominance, they called it, through drones, was cooked up at RAND. DARPA was the R&D arm that put it into play in Vietnam as the theater of warfare experimentation. This is what's so key that a lot of people don't understand about warfare, which even that I'm noticing more and more. The theaters of war in the Cold War and this kind of stuff were really just big test bed experiment places, because when you get into the Agent Orange and when you get into Annie Jacobson talking about the bio warfare that went on in Vietnam, that was early versions of weather control and geoengineering.
Yeah.
The military was doing that in Vietnam. They were trying to destroy the Viet Cong's food sources. They were trying to send rains and all kinds of crazy droughts and whatnot, whatever they could. Again, all ideas cooked up at RAND and then put into play through things like DARPA. Again, more recently, we had Total Information Awareness Network, which wasn't a think tank, but so you've got basically tons of these, dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of think tanks throughout the world. You mentioned Council on Foreign Relations. That's kind of one of these committee bodies that meets and tries to set policy for media and controlling perception. And you've got other ones that are, Builder, BERG, corporate elites. You've got steering committees like Trilateral Commission, right, which is a higher kind of level of CFR people. That was Brzezinski's thing. So there's just so many of these, all of these, not just CIA, FBI type letter groups, but these other types of groups, like you're mentioning, Jason Society. You've got things like Carnegie Foundation. You've got Rockefeller Foundation. You've got Brookings Institute. You've got there's just tons of these. I mean, you could never get through all of these.
So many of them pre-George Soros, folks. There's Soros-funded ones now, and there's plenty of those as well. But I mean, these things, again, pioneered really post-World War II. Now, you talked about beta testing technology on the war fields, and you also talked about Annie Jacobson. Now, she did a book more recently called First Platoon. And in this, she's basically talking about the advent of many of these technologies, including even smart dust, which now we're talking about a little bit more, but how it was actually utilized via the Iraqi war. She also gets into a lot of the biometrics. People didn't realize all the way back in 2003 they were taking people's eye scans and digital fingerprints in these villages and basically databasing them. This is where our drone warfare continues to this day. And I'm also glad that you brought up the fact that we were using these type of drones first in Vietnam on a large scale, because there's a lot of hype right now about, oh, Bezos is going to space and Musk is going to space and Branson's going to space. These black programs publicly had surveillance planes such as Oxcart, which were going 60,000 feet undetected in the late 50s, early 60s, Jay. So the idea that these guys are now going 50 or 60,000 feet in the air, 60,000 miles in the air, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, come on.
Yeah, I forgot too. Phoenix program is a thing that's also in Alex Abea's book. That was a thing that Rand talks about. Operation Phoenix, Paperclip, all of these things come up in Abea's book, and he mentions even the idea of counter. What's the word I'm looking? Insurgency. That's a Rand cooked up term, right? And we know that from the time of like guerrilla warfare and whatnot, that actually eventually became what they call domestic people, if you understand me, right? So Americans now are the insurgents, and we saw that kind of back in the war on TERROR, where they would drone American citizens, right? You know about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, think about during Iraq when they just wanted to label any male 16 years or older in a certain region a quote-unquote enemy combatant. All of these are semantical ideas.
Those are like Rand ideas, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. It's these things where how do we, again, it's a sales job. How do we sell it to people? What language can we use to soften the blow? You know, there's always been that great George Carlin bit about shell shock. Shell shock. You know, we used to call it shell shock. Wow, that meant something. Now what is it? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And, you know, they softened, you know, obviously PTSD is something that, you know, we're concerned about and people talk about now in a respectful manner, but when it was that heavy, shell shock, people immediately knew what that meant. Now you can have PTSD for anything, right? You can have PTSD because you had a bad day at the mall and you can't handle it because you're on a dozen different psychotropics. These same foundations are pumping at you. But in actuality, again, it softens because when you hear shell shock, it's like, man, bombs were going off. People were getting shot at. Lives were lost. Post-traumatic stress disorder, I get it, you want the medical terminology, but it's really about the semantical impact of what that means and softening the blow for further excursions into war and overseas.
Yeah, I had forgotten that until I was rereading something the other day that the psychoanalyst guys, Carl Rogers, J.B. Watson, all of those dudes, and then Skinner in the Skinner box, putting his daughter in a box, abusing his kids. That was all Rockefeller funded stuff. So all of that operant conditioning, psychological research that violated all kinds of human rights was literally all fund, just like Kinsey, all funded by Rockefeller. So if you want to get an idea of what these private, secret, off-grid foundation things do, and they don't totally do it privately because they'll kind of, maybe on their website, they'll list who gets donations and who they fund and who they help. But it's like nobody cares about that because even the Obeya book says itself that you could look at Rand as a kind of shadow government. So he uses that terminology. So that's what we're talking about here. And the idea of the victory of neoconservatism after the Big Nine event, that's all basically Rand people. And the weird part about that is that you think, oh, well, the neoconservatives, like they're all, you know, anti-commie and they're all, you know, they were big Cold Warriors. Well, it's interesting that back at the time of the Cold War, people at Rand and the CFR. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm listening. Rand and the CFR.
It says we lost connection. But
no, we're good, brother. You're going.
Okay, so at the time, they were already proposing third way. And if you don't know what third way is, that's the idea that the capitalist West, or the monopoly capitalist West, I should say, should converge and unite with the Soviet Eastern Bloc model. And that out of that thesis antithesis, we would get this synthesis of the technocracy, which would have a kind of technocratic fascist top, and then a communist collectivist socialist for the masses. So that's the way that the third way system was structured, which Rand Corporation were people were positing at during the Cold War. So that, in other words, the very people supposedly fighting and promoting the idea of the Cold War wanted a emergence of East and West communist capitalist dialectic into the synthesis, the Hegelian philosophy, to create the global technocracy, ultimately to depop and to have that post-human world that we're going into.
And I would argue about the same time, they utilized China as a means to do that. So you talked about the Rockefeller Institution and all of these NGOs. Well, it was very much Rockefeller, Brzezinski, Kissinger, and even Nixon administration philosophy to start westernizing and working with China in what you would bring about. They would get our Coca-Cola and our Levi's and our blue jeans and that form of capitalism. And meanwhile, you know, they would still keep the basic communist structure that allows, oh, I just lost him. Hopefully we'll get him back. Hopefully, I think we did just get him back. I don't have his video yet, but yes, we did get him back. All right, good. That would allow for what we see now, this top-down social credit score society with, again, Disney Entertainment and Coca-Cola and fast food and the illusion of a capitalist or free society on some levels, but total and complete censorship, top-down control, right? And really what they're boasting is the model for this fourth industrial revolution, right? Through these NGO partnerships. And just quickly, and this will probably be the only thing I even mention about the shots. If you go over to Moderna's own website, and this is in 2013, you can see the biopharma government foundations research institutes merger, and this was for mRNA tech to fight pandemics. And who is it? It's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's DARPA. It's AstraZeneca. It's Merck. It's Vertex. It's the very things that we're talking about right now. And unfortunately, these technologies are both invasive and non-invasive, Jay. You know, when we talk about human brain-computer interfaces, sure, brain chips and Neuralink technology, which is very old, is one thing. But then they have other ways to utilize injectable nanotech to do similar things, and people still think that is, in fact, some type of science fiction.
I remember making jokes about that 10 years ago. I made a parody video, not because I didn't listen to Alex, I listened, but I made a parody video just trying to be silly, and I didn't realize that within 10 years, the parody video would be real, that there would be nanotech that they were injecting into the body. And, you know, it's not that I didn't know about the documents, but I think even 10 years ago, you know, even if we knew about transhumanism, we didn't know that it would be rolling out, you know, most people didn't, unless you were at the Rand Corporation, maybe, we didn't know it would be rolling out the way that they've rolled it out. So, yeah, it's just, when you see this for what it is, right, you can see the fear, you can see the psyops, you can see the strategies that they use, and you can see it's like I always make the analogy, my friend used to say, it's like a business plan, and you have phases to a business plan where you bring in this phase, and okay, well, now we're entering business phase 2, right? Now we're entering 3, and now we're entering 4. You know, Kissinger used to talk about the acts of a play, right? He would say the destabilization, color revolutions, he says this is act 1, then there's act 2 and act 3. So all of this stuff is, again, large scale planned out. I think that's what most people who are skeptical or not awake to what's really going on, they typically say, how could things be planned out at a large scale? It just doesn't seem possible to me that there would be some group planning large scale global acceptance of ideas and social engineering. Well, look no further than the Rand Corporation. There's a gigantic public entity that exists precisely to plan and sell things on a large global scale. And verifiably, they have done it. In fact, by the end of Alex Abea's book, he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says something like, if you don't like the way that America has gone in the last 20 years in terms of what it's become, or if you do like it, you can either praise or blame the Rand Corporation because they're the chief brains behind. They may not be the money or the power, but they're the brains behind why America has become what it has.
Yeah, and I got to tell you, every time I drive by Rand and NASA when I'm coming into D.C., because, I mean, Rand's building isn't – NASA, you drive by and, like, there's a secret entrance, right? It's in the wood, like you're on, like, a kind of woodsy road, and you've got the entrance. It's NASA personnel only. Rand is, you know, a corporation. So they just kind of have a pretty tall building. I'd say it's probably like 10, 15 stories. And every time I look at it, I'm like, man – I would love to see what's going on in the upper echelons there. But I would argue this. A lot of those people in there are kind of willfully ignorant to the fact that they're doing anything harmful. You know, they've taken this sort of Bernaysian philosophy that was built up during World War II, you know, that century of self and, you know, getting, you know, women to smoke cigarettes after the fact and moving society. But I think they think they're moving society for the betterment via this technology. I really do think that a lot of people buy into their own bullshit, Jay. And I think that's the reason that so many of these people espouse these ideal sets proudly. Speak to that for a minute. That, you know, a lot of the people behind this stuff, like I would argue, for instance, Lex Friedman, you know, popular on the circuit here. He's an obvious, like, transhumanist. He doesn't think he's, you know, going to be on the wrong side of history. In a lot of respects, I think he's naive on subject matters, but it's just like Kurzweil, right? Kurzweil talks about these technologies really empowering human beings and even has spoken against the fact that, you know, we're not overpopulated and that 95% of the usable land isn't used and that we will have enough energy for everybody on the planet. And yet his technologies that he's talked about and predicted and possibly even works on at Google under the Calico division, right, the immortality division, could be used in the opposite. I mean, how many of these people are just completely naive, and how many of them are sociopathic and really believe in that kind of do as thou wilt because there isn't anything else attitude?
That's a good question. I mean, for one, so Rand will recruit a lot of people out of PhD programs to come work at Rand. And so I think it says publicly, they say they have almost 2,000 employees across the world. So in regard to them, the way that these kinds of things work, as you know, from like the military, a lot of stuff is compartmentalized. And for those that go to grad school, I went to grad school, I didn't get a PhD, but I went to grad school. The more grad school you do, the more focused and compartmentalized and niche your study is. So people that get PhDs in topics that would be relevant to Rand will spend many years studying math, studying engineering, and they'll be separate from people over there studying social engineering, right? So people overly specialize, and then they don't make cross-discipline connections. So people who know a lot about math and engineering probably don't know who Francis Galton is, right? They don't know who Huxley is. I mean, they've heard of Aldous Huxley, but they don't know about, Cold Springs Harbor and this kind of stuff. They don't know about the history of dysgenics per se. So that's how this functions, this giant machine, which does have an agenda at the top, but people recruited into it because they're so compartmentalized and they've had their nose in tons of books on one tiny minute subject. I mean, I was just talking to a guy who has a master's in engineering, and he was talking about people that go and get PhDs in engineering, and he was talking about how insanely just minutia they get into. Like, you get a PhD in engineering on like the lubricant for some oil and how to best tweak that oil in one screw, and you write a PhD thesis on this for many years, right? I mean, it's just crazy. So if you're doing that, and I can say from being in academia and being around that world for many years, people in one discipline, they don't know anything that's going on in the building down the road. So they don't know psyops. They don't know what's going on with, the history of dysgenics. They don't know the history of that kind of stuff. So that's how it works in terms of ignorance and compartmentalization. Everybody knows this too with the Manhattan Project, right? It operated that way. People building these things, they'd be building one little part, and they had no idea what it went to. The whole machine, right?
99.9% of the people working on it had no idea what they were working on. They didn't know they were working on any type of a weapon system whatsoever. It was really only those compartmentalized at the top. So I guess, now that we're here in 2022, what is the future for 2022 if we're listening to the Rand Corporation and these other type of think tanks that have basically talked about this post-COVID 1984 society where surveillance will play a much larger role? And, you could even look to the airways industry and security at airports and other establishments of mass transit, and the plans that have openly been on paper for the last decade, and how they want to basically normalize even more big tech surveillance. If you thought taking your shoes off and getting in the cancer scanner was the worst out there, that's nothing compared to what they truly have planned. They really have this minority report style system to come into place in mass transit. So will we see that rapidly deployed over the next year, or are we going to see that kind of incrementally deployed over the next 8 years? My fear is it is going to be rapidly deployed.
Yeah, no, I was going to say my fear is the rapid deployment, precisely because of everything that happened in 2021. And I would expect things to get really crazy. What exactly that'll be, I don't know, but I have seen in the last year, just following tweets from the Rand Corporation, a lot of promotion of the very things that you said, the QR promotion of how we can implement the QR code, how we can do more DOWN, how all of that kind of stuff. So basically everything that we've seen, how can we do more of it, is the tweets that I've seen in the last year from the Rand Corporation. So I would imagine they have it war gamed out, because again, remember one idea that Rand talked about a long time ago that the Pentagon eventually adopted was full spectrum dominance. That's a Rand idea. So with full spectrum dominance comes that model of Internet of Things, everything being tracked and traced, everything being modeled in supercomputers, where real-time recording and tracking of everything going in the real world over in a sim model, probably somewhere underground under the Pentagon. I don't know where it is, but that's what they cook up. That's what they want. So I would be afraid of a quicker kind of thing than an 8-year incremental model.
Well, it wouldn't be a great show without a possible copyright restriction. So let's let Milhouse take it away on the Rand Corporation.
Here's what we've got. The Rand Corporation, in conjunction with the Saucer People. Thank you. Under the supervision of the Reverse Vampires.
I just love the Reverse Vampires. I had to get to that part, folks. I mean,
that's a conspiracy theory I've never heard of, but it should be popular. Like that one needs to come back.
That's one of my favorites. Like, because I think that's like first 3 seasons, and basically what's going on is all these parents are they have some libido drug, and they're going home, and they're basically going home to bang each other, and they're leaving the kids outside. They don't know why their parents don't want to hang out with them, and so there's a giant conspiracy. And I got to admit, folks, that's probably 27 to 30 years old. That would be 100% the first time I ever heard about the Rand Corporation. His name is Jay Dyer. Jay, I love doing these shows. We always bang out an hour extremely quick. Tell people what you got coming up, how they can support you over at Jay's Analysis. Tell them about the Rockfin channel and all the other goodies, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned too that NASA document about the 2025 coming crazy transhumanist psyop warfare type stuff, because I've forgotten that document. I did it a year ago. We did an analysis of that over on Rockfin, so that's exclusive to Rockfin. If you want to scroll back and find I think I titled it something like "Mutating Man" or something like that. But I went into that document that you saw Burma's talking about there. So you'd have to subscribe over on Rockfin. It's been great. One year, I think, almost of Rockfin, and really loving it. Totally awesome free speech-based platform. So if you subscribe, you get access to me, to Burmis, to Sam Tripoli, to Richard Grove, all these red pill-based dudes. What's coming up? Well, hopefully be able to continue to host the 4th hour of Lord Voldemort's show. I'm sure everybody knows who I'm talking about. So we just did a good installment of that about the alien deception, I think 4 or 5 days ago. If you didn't see that, definitely check that out. I put that up on Rockfin as well. I'll be doing some more. I just put out basically constant live streams. So, and they're just whatever. So, what did we cover recently? A lot of religious critiques, a lot of critiques of the papacy lately. Going to continue doing that. And then I hope to eventually dive deep into an analysis of this Phoenix Program book, because not only does that relate to the MK Ultra stuff, but Phoenix Program actually ties in a lot of these Vietnam test bed things that we're seeing rolled out now, even the transhumanist tech stuff, believe it or not. But so looking forward to trying to dig into that soon.
Well, Mr. Dyer, a pleasure as always. I hope we can fight back in 2022, man. I think this agenda is going to be pushing forward, but I think that at the same time, human beings are special. We are not meat puppets, as Rand wants you to believe. This Malthus garbage is just that. We have a human spirit, and the more of us that realize that, and the power of the human spirit, the power of the human mind, the power of the human will to go out and create things, to love one another, to embrace one another, is much greater than that of a few predatory class members that want to enslave us with their digital technology. I just believe it. I'm going to fight it to the very end, and I'm hoping in the next year, even though things were tough, censorship was big. I had one of my best years. I hope you had one of your best too, Jay. And
I did, yeah.
Exactly. And I hope that we have even better years in 2022. We'll be talking soon, brother. Thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
So that is Jay Dyer, everybody. You know where to find him, jaysanalysis.com. He absolutely kicks ass. Thumbs it up. Can we get a little over 200 thumbs up over on the live stream if you're watching on YouTube? I want to remind everybody I've had my YouTube channel taken away 4 separate times. That's not suspended, folks. That's not stricken. I've had my channel taken away from me 4 separate times. Right now, we're riding kind of dirty, but all of a sudden, strikes are disappearing because we talked to some human beings on Twitter, and with your pressure, we were able to make a difference. I do want to tell people that you see this stuff, but we got a couple Rockfin exclusives. Oh, you don't have those over here? That's right. I was able to get on, I don't know who recommended me, but UK Talk Radio, which is basically Sky News over there, which is obviously like a Murdoch product. And I got to expose the Epstein network on 2 separate shows for almost a half an hour total, talking about things that you're not seeing in the mainstream media. That's actually put out by those guys. You can watch it on their channels as well. But if you want to see it, I probably couldn't put it on my channel. That's all I'm saying. These days, you never know. One of my last strikes is for cyberbullying Epstein. I want to thank Odyssey for backing my channel up. I want to let everybody know the documentary films, Loose Change, Final Cut, Fabled Enemies, Invisible Empire, A New World Order Defined, and Shade the Motion Picture are all free right here, right now in the playlist section. I got a GoFundMe. That's one of the best ways that you can support me, but I do want to say this. If you have the premium subscription, it's $99.99 for the year or $9.99 a month. You support me or Jay Dyer, you get everybody's stuff. That's everybody's stuff. Another great way to empower creators through free speech platforms rather than enslave minds through false and phony globalist narratives. I love you guys, and I will see you all on the flip side.